Hello, everyone. My name is Jeanette Southwood. I'm the Vice President, Corporate Affairs and Strategic Partnerships at Engineers Canada. My pronouns are she, her, elle. It's with great pleasure that I welcome you to today's webinar, Synergizing Sustainability and Equity, a blueprint for exceptional low-carbon buildings. This webinar is taking place during National Engineering Month, a month that celebrates the heart and soul of engineers, our passion, our commitment, and our action towards making the world a better place. I myself am coming to you today from Engineers Canada's office, which is located on the traditional and unceded lands of the Omami, Winniniwag, Algonquin, Anishinaabe peoples. I want to thank everyone who is joining us today, and in particular, all of my fellow engineers and engineering graduates and the engineering students. We've all taken different paths that have led us to participating in this webinar today. I'm an engineer. I'm an able-bodied woman. I am Black. I'm an immigrant. I was the first person in my immediate family to attend university. Engineers play a critical role in improving the resilience of our society, working with members of other professions and members of many communities. The topics of sustainability and equity, diversity and inclusion in engineering is a professional and personal passion of mine. Before joining Engineers Canada as Vice President of Corporate Affairs and Strategic Partnerships, I held global, national, and local roles at an international engineering consulting company, including leading the Global Sustainable Cities and Canadian Urban Development and Infrastructure sector teams. I was the first Black woman to be appointed to the senior leadership position of principal globally at that firm. The connection between equity, diversity, inclusion, and sustainability is undeniable, and I'm fortunate to continue to make a contribution in this space through my work at Engineers Canada. Engineers Canada is the only national voice of the engineering profession. We are the National Association of the Provincial and Territorial Engineering Regulators who license the more than 300,000 members of the engineering profession in Canada. You'll soon hear from our moderator, my colleague Eileen Shomey from Engineers Canada, as well as our panelists, Kim Bouffard from Engineers Canada and Dan Dicaire on behalf of the Climate Risk Institute. I'm joined here now by Sam Page of the Climate Risk Institute, also known as CRI. In 2020, Engineers Canada transferred the Infrastructure Resilience Professional Training Program to CRI. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. I'm a senior climate resiliency specialist with the Climate Risk Institute, where I lead projects and initiatives designed to advance sectoral, municipal, provincial, territorial, national, as well as international efforts on climate change risk, resiliency planning, implementation, as well as capacity building. I currently reside in the unceded lands of Chipuktuk and Mi'kma'ki, which means Great Harbor. As someone who works in the climate space and spends a lot of time in nature, I truly strive to hold the Mi'kmaq concept of Ndugulim at the forefront of my work and interactions. Ndugulim is an approach to resource management, which means to have enough, but not more than enough. It focuses on the core values of respect, of responsibility, relationship, and reciprocity, which are critical within our collective work on sustainability, as well as equity, diversity, and inclusion. The Climate Risk Institute is a not-for-profit, academically affiliated organization that works to build capacity, advance practices, and deliver services for climate change risk assessment, adaptation, and resiliency planning in Canada and abroad. We do this work in a variety of different ways, but one we are focusing on today is capacity building within the context of the low carbons building space. Last year, with funding from the Government of Canada's Sectoral Workforce Solutions Program and the Canadian Green Building Council, or CGBC, as well as partners from across the low carbon building space, including architects, construction, building owners and managers, real estate, and engineers, we developed and delivered specialized training courses to improve collaboration among leading industry associations and increase the reach into the industry to build knowledge and skills for low carbon solutions. In collaboration with Engineers Canada and a very talented team of subject matter experts, including Dan Dicaire, who you'll hear from today, CRI developed specialized low carbon training specifically for engineers with the goal of equipping engineering professionals, as well as those who work with engineers, with collaborative decision-making, design, construction, and operation skills and knowledge to retrofit and build the low-carbon buildings needed for a climate-resilient future. A little bit about the course. This specialized course consists of 6 modules covering guiding principles of low-carbon development, rethinking low-carbon targets through policy standards and Indigenous engagement, planning and integrated design process considerations, technologies, and methods, monitoring, evaluation, learning, and reporting, as well as building a socially just business case for low carbon. If you're interested in taking this course, we will share registration links to some upcoming opportunities before the end of the session. And given the audience today, I would also like to share that CRI offers 6 courses for engineers as part of the Infrastructure Resilient Professional Credential that was inherited from Engineers Canada, and I will also provide a link for that before the end of today's sessions. But today in this webinar, we will discuss specifically the low carbon buildings training course, how the course draws connections between social and inequality, including gender inequality, the climate crisis, as well as affordable housing, and the role of engineers in retrofitting existing buildings and designing new low carbon buildings across Canada. Pass it back to Jeanette.
Thanks, Sam. So as we continue to experience the impacts of climate change, not only here in Canada, but around the world, we know that we will need to continue to attract the best and brightest minds into this field and also into the engineering profession. And that means we need to do better at attracting and retaining individuals from marginalized groups, groups that will bring new ideas and perspectives, groups that we know are disproportionately impacted by climate change here in Canada and around the world. Engineers Canada has been working in this space for many years, and our work has had national and global impact. At Engineers Canada, we know that our collective impact is much greater than what any one person or group can achieve on their own. And we're proud to be partnering with the Canada Green Building Council, with Polytechnique Montréal, and with CRI, including with CRI on this webinar. And we're proud to be working together and with you to make the engineering profession more sustainable. Back to you, Sam.
Today, you will be hearing from both Kim and Dan on the connections between EDI and sustainability when it comes to developing and retrofitting low carbon buildings in the Canadian housing context, as well as how to rise to the challenge of net zero buildings, presenting a clear path forward to address some of the most pressing issues of our time. Without further ado, I will pass it over to Eileen to get things started. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jeanette, for that introduction. As you've heard, my name is Eileen Shomi, and I use she, her pronouns. Today, I'm very delighted to be engaging in this conversation with our speakers today to talk about the Specialized Low Carbon Training Buildings course, which has been designed for engineers as well as other practitioners. In today's discussion, we will be talking about how the course allows engineers and other practitioners to get the knowledge and the skill set that is necessary for them to retrofit buildings, as well as design new low carbon buildings. We'll also be making connections between inequality, including gender inequality, in relation to climate change, affordable housing, and sustainability as a whole. But first, I would like to provide a brief introduction about today's speakers. Joining us today is Dan Dicaire. Dan is a professional engineer and a certified energy manager. He has over 14 years of experience working in greenhouse gas reduction planning, as well as the development of high-performance buildings and sustainability. Dan supported the development of Ontario's first mixed-use passive house and led Canada's first net zero panelized deep energy retrofit at 197 Preston Road. He is now supporting Ottawa Community Housing and other housing providers to implement various deep energy retrofit strategies in order to achieve net zero and greenhouse gas reduction goals. As well, we also have Kim Bouffard joining us today. Kim is the manager of the Belonging and Engagement team here at Engineers Canada. She oversees Engineers Canada's work towards gender equity, truth and reconciliation, as well as other equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. She manages the organization's outreach and engagement initiatives, including 2 national system change projects, which are the 30 by 30 initiative, as well as the K-12 Collective Impact. Kim also serves as the interim president for the Canadian Coalition of Women in Engineering, Science, Trades, and Technology, and she has spent over 15 years supporting different organizations to address social issues, including poverty, food insecurity, and gender inequity, to mention a few. Welcome, Kim and Dan, and I'm super excited to be engaging in today's discussion about the Low Carbon's training course.
Thanks, Eileen.
Yes, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Dan, can you tell us how Engineers Canada started to collaborate on this project with the Canada Green Building Council, as well as Polytechnique Montréal, and how they all came together? So basically just setting some context for how this course came about.
So what we're actually dealing with here is a very large reskilling effort that is taking place in Canada. So the Canada Green Building Council actually got a large piece of funding from the Sectoral Workforce Solution Program, which is part of the Climate Change and a Just Transition funding from the federal government. And basically the problem that we're tackling is that in the next 20, 30 years, pretty much we've got to get to net zero. So the entire existing portfolio needs to be retrofitted, and all of the new buildings that we're starting to put out, we've got to aggressively be reducing their carbon emissions and getting them to net zero by 2050 if they're not on the day that they open their doors. So the program that the CAGBC is doing, there is what we call the core course. And they are doing some of the more, your more basic background information on low carbon economy, and they've got 5 different modules that they go through. But they've also partnered with different groups like Engineers Canada. They're also doing a group with architecture professionals, realty professionals, as well as tradesmen. So they are creating these specialized courses that complement the core course. And they're working with that industry specifically. So for our course, which is looking more at the engineering profession and engineering professionals, that's where they started putting together Polytechnique Montréal. We've got Engineers Canada, and who brought in CRI. And so we're all trying to tackle this aspect of this larger reskilling program.
And so for this reskilling program that you're talking about, what exactly is the goal? Are you saying that all buildings need to be retrofitted by a certain time? What exactly is the big goal?
Yeah, no, effectively, I mean, if we're trying to meet our Paris climate targets, all buildings need to be net zero by 2050. And in fact, we probably need to do that even earlier in terms of some of the increases that we've been seeing in the past couple of years. And in all honesty, that is a perfect challenge to put to the engineering profession. That is very, very important, and it is core because all of the decisions that they make throughout the design process those are decisions that impact the overall embodied carbon as well as operational carbon from those buildings.
And this question goes to you, Dan. I know that you have a background as a professional engineer, as well as the fact that you are a certified energy manager. So what exactly do you see as the role of engineers in the development of low carbon buildings?
I think the role of engineers is paramount in the production of low carbon buildings. I kind of like to think that we're the ones who make dreams come true. The engineers are going to use their creativity to achieve those challenging goals that the clients are going to put forward, right? So what's important is for those engineers to see themselves as part of those goals, to realize what they can bring to the table. Now, unfortunately, if they haven't been part of a low carbon building, or if this is something new, maybe they don't see the impact that they can have on that project, especially when you get into some of those more traditional roles. Maybe your structural engineer is like, I don't really see how I contribute to a low carbon building. But the answer is, you're going to make choices about the type of concrete or about the structure. Those products, you're actually making choices about the embodied carbon for that project. Similarly, our high performance buildings that we're trying to put out, they need significantly more insulation. They need continuous air barriers. And the structural engineer, well, it's actually their responsibility to make sure that that extra cladding, that extra insulation is properly adhered to the building or is structurally sound in terms of how it's going to be performing for the next 60, 100 years. So it's trying to make the engineers that are maybe in more traditional roles to see that they actually control or they have huge amounts of input and huge impact on the actual performance of that buildings. Your electrical engineers, now we're talking about having on-site generation. We're talking about including EV chargers into those buildings. That is a whole new way of designing, not to mention the electrification that comes along with eliminating fossil fuels from our buildings and from the operations. And whether that's in an existing building context, which is very challenging when we've got existing infrastructure, or in a new development context, they need to start seeing themselves as part of that goal, because there is huge impact from the decisions that the engineer makes at the design stage all the way to the actual operation of that building, which is going to be with us for, 60, 100 years.
Great. And I'll maybe direct this question to you, Kim. Given that Engineers Canada plays a unique role in supporting the 12 provincial and territorial regulators in Canada, they also uphold the honor and integrity of the profession. So tell us, why did Engineers Canada decide to support this project in particular?
Engineers Canada has been actually engaged in this issue for a long time. We've been engaged in a variety of different ways, from the development of guidelines. One of the most important guidelines that we developed around this is the Principles for Sustainable Development and Environmental Stewardship. Not only did we develop a guideline, but we actually worked in collaboration with Polytechnique Montréal to develop a whole, it's called MOOC. So it's a massive open online course that's actually launching again in April that would help to support engineers who are engaging in this space. We also have been engaging with the federal government. We've developed a number of different national position statements. We, presented to the House of Commons. We presented to the Senate to ensure that engineers' voices and opinions are heard within this area. And we've actually worked with the Climate Risk Institute before. And so this project is really an extension and continuation of that work. So we knew that the Climate Risk Institute had the skills and the experience to develop a course that would help to continue to support engineers in this domain. And so when this opportunity arose, we knew that they were the ideal partner to be able to try and develop something to help support us getting to net zero.
Sounds great. And now, speaking about Engineers Canada's role in particular, can you speak on the particular approaches that were taken by Engineers Canada in getting involved in this project?
As I mentioned, we had worked with the Climate Risk Institute before, and so we knew that they had the skills and the subject matter expertise to be able to produce the technical components of what engineers need to know to do this. And so when we were getting involved in this, I was really starting to think about, well, where's the unique value add that Engineers Canada can contribute specifically to this? But as you know, Engineers Canada has also done a significant investment in trying to create a more inclusive profession. And so we're like, well, how do we incorporate that into this? Because it's super relevant. And so we did that in a couple of ways. So one of the first ways is, like you said, right from the get-go, around when we're starting to conceptualize what does this course look like, we tapped into our network and we wanted to make sure that the Climate Risk Institute and the content developers had access to a real variety, a diverse set of engineers, both geographically, but also, we want to make sure they had access to women. We gave them access to our Indigenous Advisory Committee. We tapped into our 30 by 30 network. So we made sure that right from the get-go, as they're starting to dream up what this course should look like, given the content, to be working with a diverse set of stakeholders, to just a group of people, to make sure that those lenses, those perspectives, those lived experiences were taken into consideration and how it was put together. In addition, on my team, I have 2 EDI experts, content experts. And so they, so time was given for them to be able to go through every module and throughout the course to take a look at it from that EDI lens again. This course, and we're going to get into maybe a little more detail around like specifically how it's designed, but essentially this course has like virtual modules, and then there's opportunities for in-person sessions. And so right now the course is being offered at no cost to anybody. And for marginalized groups specifically, they've set aside specific spaces to make sure that, those who are interested, who are from a marginalized group, are able to access and be part of the course. And for those in-person ones, we've even provided funding to ensure that if the course isn't somewhere that's, accessible to you, that we will pay for you to come, to be able to come and participate in this course. So that's some of the ways that we helped with its development and with accessibility for people to actually participate. But if you want sort of specific examples of what it actually, how did it actually present itself within the course, I would say that this happened in a variety of different ways. So the one thing that we didn't do, and we did this intentionally, is we didn't have like one module that's like EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion for net zero buildings. Instead, when you're trying to create and design a net zero building, a lot of it is about the approach. And so we wanted to, and that's sort of the approach that we took. We wanted to make sure that it's embedded throughout the course, all along the way, through every process as you're starting to have conversations. And so it starts off, for instance, with the land acknowledgement. We make sure that there is, a number of different resources that they can access, like our guideline on, sort of how to meaningfully engage and consult with Indigenous people when you're starting to do work with them. But the first course, the first module is sort of that context setting module. And so when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about net zero, we're also talking about why is it that marginalized groups are being disproportionately impacted by this? So we're helping to set the context building right there from the get-go. And then it also is showing up, like I said, all throughout the course, but another example would be like module 3, where in module 3, so you've learned about, why it is and how it is that marginalized groups are disproportionately impacted. So what do you do about that? Like, how do you meaningfully engage them? And so that's where, we have reference to our guideline, but then that whole module is really talking about the sort of integrated design process and how are you bringing in these different groups in a meaningful way. I mean, in an ideal world, like I said, long-term, what we want them helping to lead the project. We want them to be the skills. But today, right now, since we don't have enough of those groups at the table in those leadership roles, how are we meaningfully engaging them so that way these projects are relevant? And that's a big part of module 3. But the person who could actually speak to this better than I is actually Dan. So Dan is not only helped to design the course, but he's actually one of the instructors. And I know that when we were thinking about what case studies we wanted to use, like what's one of the reasons why we really wanted to engage Dan, because he has loads of experience in this realm. So maybe I'll pass it to you, Dan.
Mm-hmm. Well, how about it? I think you did a great job of describing it. Basically, I'd say like the first 3 modules, we go through a lot, but that first one is that context setting that helps to understand climate change, but also from a marginalized population side of things. The module 2 also talks about policy and tries to help kind of tease out the differences from the federal point of view, from the provincial point of view, and also talks about that Indigenous engagement aspect. And like you say, module 3, we're really trying to discuss how to expand boundary conditions, to think about your project, not just as a site, but as how it interacts with kind of the ecosystem, both the societal ecosystem, the economic ecosystem that surrounds it, in order to identify interested parties that maybe you wouldn't have thought of before, and making sure that they are at the table and how we can include them so that we get a better product that is going to last, the 100 years that building is going to be around for. Also, we're using the Ottawa Community Housing Presslin Net Zero project as a case study. I think is a fantastic idea. Not just because I think it's a fantastic project, but really it kind of frames it from that point of view of these vulnerable populations that Ottawa Community Housing serves, how those are, like, at the end of the day, we're all paying, these are societal assets, is actually a way to frame it. Those are public assets, and in fact, it makes a lot of sense for some of those government investments to go in maintaining those government assets, making sure that they are sustainable, because those are the vulnerable populations that can't necessarily do that for themselves, but also that need to be sustainable for the long term. So using the Presslin project as a case study really helps to frame that. And it also shows a little bit of our process and how we engage with the tenants ahead of time, trying to do this pilot project, how they would be impacted throughout the process. I mean, the communication throughout this project was extensive. The tenants had my personal phone number. I can tell you I got some late night calls sometimes, but at the same time, that was also extremely useful because those were calls that I wanted to get, because if something was wrong, we wanted to know very early on in the process, but really keeping them involved, understanding what was going to be happening within their homes, because at the end, like, these are people's homes. So when you're doing this type of work, you really want to respect that. And at the end of the day, they are now benefiting from that process. I can tell you, of all of the nice shiny things that are on that building, central air conditioning was the biggest on that first long May weekend where that air conditioning turned on. That was a fantastic day for those tenants. And yeah, that's kind of the way that we've managed to incorporate all of that into the course.
So you both have been talking about marginalized groups, so equity deserving groups, people in the margins, people who experience a unique set of barriers and face discrimination, because of, they don't have access to resources in the way that other folks do. And this is because of the systemic exclusion that has happened and continues to happen. You're speaking about accessibility and how this impacts marginalized groups in particular. So talking about climate change, and I'll ask you this question, Dan, how exactly can net zero buildings address climate change as well as the housing crisis in the way that it impacts different populations?
Well, I mean, the housing crisis and the climate crisis, these things are very much linked. Our buildings are contributing to those GHG emissions that we need to eliminate in order to meet our climate change targets. But unfortunately, sometimes people see environmental goals or some of those energy performance targets as limiting factors in terms of preventing us from fixing our housing crisis. That couldn't be farther from the truth. In fact, having inefficient buildings is part of how we got into this mess in the first place, both on the climate crisis and on the housing crisis. I mean, when we produce a inefficient building, if you will, that building, it costs more to operate. It is going to last less long. If we didn't design it properly, we've got to do more retrofits. It costs more to maintain. It's also putting a larger strain on the overall infrastructure in terms of the amount of energy that needs to be brought to it. And that means that limits the development around it, right? We've got all of these constraints that are putting even more pressure on that housing crisis situation. So an efficient building, a low carbon building, actually brings so much to the community. It's a building that perhaps is generating its own electricity, or at least is not putting any strain on the community, on the infrastructure. It's usually producing a much more healthy environment for the occupants. It costs much less to operate, and therefore it becomes a more sustainable building for those 100 years, right? Like sometimes, unfortunately, we are finite beings and we imagine things within our own lifetime or within, 5-10 year time frames. Buildings are with us for hundreds of years. Over 80% of the buildings that are going to be with us in 2050 are already built. And those inefficient buildings, they're a weight that is limiting our capacity to reach those aggressive climate goals. So, and not to mention when we talk about maybe more the vulnerable populations or equity deserving groups, they are the ones that are the most impacted by climate change. They're also the ones that can suffer from those inefficient buildings. That means that you have more expensive utility bills, maybe more repairs, more work that needs to take place on that building. It costs more to maintain that building. So really having low carbon efficient buildings contribute to society in terms of removing that burden, right? And those equity deserving groups are usually the ones that are the most affected. So really they're the ones that deserve some of those efficient low carbon buildings moving into the future. And that's a lot of some of the work that OCH is doing. I mean, on a regular basis. We maintain those 15,000 units of social housing in Ottawa, and we are working to expand those with some really high performance, low carbon buildings. We're adding units every single year, but we're also looking at deep energy retrofits or retrofitting our existing portfolio in order to produce some high performance, low carbon buildings and decarbonize our portfolio. That's the project that we did at Presslin, for example. We took this 1960s 4-unit block of townhomes, and it has been completely converted to a net zero building. We re-insulated that building from the outside. The tenants actually were inside the building during that retrofit. We replaced all of the natural gas equipment with heat pump equipment, which means we got rid of all of the on-site fossil fuel combustion. And with that new building envelope, with that new mechanical system, we'd reduce the energy consumption by 66%, which is that first step, right? You get that energy efficiency. Then to make it a net zero building, we put 35 kilowatts of solar on the roof. And so now that building is generating as much energy as it is consuming over a year in a 1-year period. And the people that are benefiting from that are the tenants of those homes, right? They are now in one of the best performing buildings in Ottawa, and we're hoping to bring that type of a strategy. I mean, it was a pilot project, so we've learned lots of lessons along the way. There's many things that we do differently, but we're trying to take those lessons and spread them throughout the entire portfolio so that we can decarbonize our entire portfolio. And we're bringing those same lessons learned to our new developments so that the buildings that we're putting out today, we don't need to retrofit in 20 years. They're going to be positively contributing for the next 100 years. And that makes affordable housing truly affordable and sustainable for the long term.
I was just going to say, like, one of the things I really like about your project, because we talk about like its connection to net zero, but then we're also talking about the housing crisis. So your pilot, one of the things that really caught my attention about it is the fact that part of your approach was making sure that you didn't displace your tenants while you were doing this retrofit. Anyway, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that and how you were, because that was really...
Well, how about we can't take all the credit. So this is kind of modeled after the Energy Sprong project that took place in the Netherlands. Basically, they kind of piloted this approach of we'll do a retrofit from the outside, and they basically contracted out their entire social housing portfolio for all the Netherlands to kind of one company to do this. We've been working with NRCan since 2017 to try and bring that approach, if you will, into a Canadian context. One company can't service all of Canada. We've got different building stocks than they have over there. We've got different building stocks across Canada and different electricity or energy grid requirements. So we were really trying to adapt that model here. But what you said is exactly right, Kim. We had to retrofit them. We didn't have any place to move people out during this project. So, and looking into the future, we need to retrofit those buildings in the next 20 years. We won't have any significant space. There's a 10,000 person waiting list right now just in Ottawa. So in order not to contribute to the issue, we needed to find a strategy that allowed our tenants to stay in place, but still decarbonize and do this revitalization, this renewal of that property. And what's really interesting that I enjoy tying it back to what you were saying is that that's a challenge for engineers.
Sounds like there's clearly been a whole lot of thought that has gone into this work. And so I was wondering, can you speak to some of the elements in the course in particular in the way that it equips engineers with that knowledge that they need to go through this entire process?
That is a great question because I'll be honest from the beginning, we don't have all the answers. In fact, Kim can speak to trying to get standards to be in place, and then all of a sudden 5 years later you finally got it published and the whole landscape has changed, right? That is the case that we find ourselves with, especially in sustainability and low carbon buildings. So the first thing that I will say is that the goal of this course is to stimulate conversations between engineering professionals, right? We are presenting some case studies, some guiding principles, but at the end of the day, we don't have all the answers and we don't know what exact problems they'll be facing in the next 5-10 years, right? But what we do know is that when you put engineers together in a room and you feed them some challenges, they're going to come up with some solutions. So we really tried to create that collaborative space. But yes, we are looking through the course. We're talking about kind of that climate crisis and especially the importance of the engineers' ethics towards the project that they're producing. We use Engineers Canada's Code of Ethics to try and frame, hey, what are your responsibilities towards a project in the first place? It also translates to reporting to our clients what the impacts of certain decisions will be. Unfortunately, I mean, we're always trying to stay within a budget, but imagine if nowadays some of those, the Code of Ethics gets applied in a way that says you need to report to your client the impact of going with a standard concrete build, the impact of not having on-site renewables or something like that in terms of the GHG implications of your project. We also touch on the policy aspect of things, trying to, there's some pretty muddy waters in terms of where GHG responsibilities lie between the federal government and the provincial government. We try to give a little bit of guideline surrounding that, but the answer is that it ends up being a global problem, so we really have to expand those boundary conditions. And that's actually some of the other modules that we do, talk about expanding those boundary conditions. How do we frame each one of our projects, not just with the site and with the next 5-10 years in mind, but really with the full life of that building, as well as within a global context with varying different factors and labor sources and products and try to really bring that into each project so that we make better decisions. And then we link that to different energy budgets and carbon budgets, the exact same way that we have financial budgets for projects. We need to start making energy budgets and carbon budgets so that we are guided throughout the development, throughout the design process. We know we want to stay within a certain budget because then we can't build the building if we don't have enough money. Well, we also shouldn't be building that building if we don't have enough energy or if we exceed our carbon budget, right? And then we try to tie all of that together in terms of some of the new ways of framing things. We do a business model canvas exercise where we take these elements, we translate them into maybe some of the harder some of the more intangible aspects of the negative externalities of certain decisions, or also some of the social benefits, the positive impacts that projects can have. And we try to frame it in a way that you can make a really strong business case so that that financial budget at the beginning, you're able to really make a strong business case to include low carbon developments, to do deep energy retrofits, all of that type of work.
Mm-hmm. So just to hear, so you covered a lot there, but I think right now what I'm hearing is it's a very exciting time to be an engineer. So if you like to try and solve interesting problems, here's one. So not only with net zero buildings do you have the challenge of, okay, we need to make sure that we have this building that is, net zero, essentially. And so there's all kinds of design, but we also need to ensure that these buildings are buildings that people want to be in. Mm-hmm. So you could design a net zero building pretty easily. It could be a thick box with one window, but that's not going to meet the needs of society. I mean, net zero buildings are exciting to me because it forces you to have to think about your future public. You have to think about your future public because exactly what you were saying, right? It's like these buildings are going to be around for generations. And so when you're designing them, you have to be thinking about what are the needs of the people today and of multiple generations later. And so we're starting to make engineers have to really understand the populations and the communities that they're serving to meet their present and future needs, which are changing. In addition, you have to be able to take care of the global challenge of we have to decrease the amount of carbon that we're releasing into the atmosphere. We're currently in a climate crisis, and buildings are the way to do it right now. We don't need any new tech. We don't need, you know what I mean? Like, we could get this done when it comes to buildings. So yeah, I mean, it is a lot more to put on engineers. So not only do you have to understand the social context to make sure that you're meeting the community needs and the social needs, but now you also have this additional layer of the environmental needs, because that impacts everybody.
And I love what you're saying right now, because I actually see that a perfect link into diversity inclusion, right? Because maybe the answer that somebody say, well, I don't know about that. Well, fantastic. I assure you that there are hundreds of people with that knowledge that maybe you're missing. And I don't think engineers would shy away from that challenge. We just need to give those opportunities to have those conversations to maybe understand what we might be missing. Because imagine if you're trying to put this in a global context, right? What better person to have at the table, perhaps, than an engineer who maybe has family in Pakistan and understands the impact of that global climate change? Or even better, maybe we could stay national and say, what if one of the engineers at the table or one of the engineering professionals at the table has family or comes from a community up north whose permafrost might be thawing and their community might be threatened by some of that climate change? All of a sudden, what more of a powerful way, I assure you that person is going to put much more effort into that building downtown Ottawa, downtown Toronto, because they see that global impact, that national impact on the decisions that they're making in a city that is thousands of kilometers away, right? Yeah. But we really need to start broadening that discussion in that way.
And you mentioned earlier how this is not tokenism, right? And so how exactly are these low carbon buildings catering to marginalized groups specifically in ways that regular buildings cannot?
Well, I feel like it's like twofold. So one is that it presents an opportunity. So we sort of talked about how we know that in order for us to get there and the amount of work involved, that we need a whole other labor force, essentially, right? And so there's this opportunity. And so one way that we could be uniquely engaging and working with marginalized groups is by ensuring that as we're starting to upskill, which is what this whole course is about, that we're really focusing on these populations and ensuring that they're able to meaningfully engage. And that needs to be done really intentionally, or else what will end up happening is there'll be, we'll just end up probably in the same spot that we are right now, right? We'll be filling it up, but it won't be filling it up with with Indigenous folks, with women, those, because there's an opportunity to change course here if we're very intentional about it. So I think that's one way that I see net zero buildings being able to uniquely contribute in a way that maybe traditional buildings can't. Well, I guess traditional buildings sort of can there too, but I think that because it requires the new skills and because of the upskilling, I just think that there's an opportunity that if you're going to be investing in upskilling, it's about, where you're putting those resources. So I think that is a unique opportunity that's related to that.
Yeah. And then I look at it also perhaps from when that building is actually built and operated, right? So, at Ottawa Community Housing, the reason that it makes sense for us to produce low carbon, high efficiency buildings is because that is actually what a sustainable housing stock looks like. Both from an operational side of things, those buildings will cost us less to maintain in the long run, and they will cost us less to operate, right? Having a high performance building is an asset rather than a liability. Our solar panels are assets rather than liabilities that are helping us to tackle the climate change. And that also translates to our tenants. If there's a term in the industry, we call it energy poverty, right? We can produce a lot of really cheap, inefficient housing, but if your utility bill is $500, $800 a month, it doesn't matter that your rent is only $100. You've still created that inequality. So the way that when I look at our portfolio and the buildings that we're building nowadays in terms of that high performance, reaching that high performance, low carbon standard, I see that contributing to true affordability, because those marginalized groups, those vulnerable populations, we need to provide them with that they're the ones who deserve that high efficiency building so that they don't have this additional liability. They've finally gotten their housing. We don't need to burden them with that additional energy poverty aspect of things. And that is that security or that sustainability that a high performance, low carbon building can bring to that population.
Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Kim?
I just really appreciate the approach that the CAGBC decided to take for this. When you think about engineers, and when you're talking to engineers, especially about this kind of work, they're in this unique position, and in that they have a job to do, and it's being commissioned by a client, and so the engineer often doesn't have the final say, and so they're in a position of influence, but they often don't get the final decision. And so the engineer, it's a very collaborative process where the engineers are working with the tradesmen who are building the buildings. They're working with the architect who are helping to do certain elements of the design, and then they're working with the developer who's funding this project. And so the engineer is in this unique position where they have an opportunity to take a leadership role by making sure that all the respective parties, all the groups that they're having to work with, understand what their options are and understand the pros and the cons. And given the ethical responsibilities that engineers have to protect the public and to the environment, and given how we're starting to redefine what that means a little bit, like what was a safe, good design 50 years ago isn't what it is today, and it certainly isn't what it's going to be 50 years from now. But we have to anticipate that, because as Dan has said multiple times, when we build today, we're building a building that's going to be around for the next 100 years. So engineers are in this unique position to help developers and help the trades and everyone who has to come together to collaborate to make this building function, help them to sort of see that bigger picture and help them to have a clear understanding of what are the options that exist for you to get there, and what like you said, these externalities, that more and more we're asking for the developers to take on, like more and more we're hearing municipalities say, no, it's not enough. We're not going to, if you design a building, and we know that now because of the changing climate, that we're going to be experiencing significantly more flooding. Municipalities aren't wanting to take that on anymore. They're like, no, we expect you that if you're going to win this bid to build these projects, that you're going to have to make that part of your design of how you're going to handle that water. And so engineers are being asked more than ever to be able to think about and think ahead about how they can and be able to communicate that information, so that way the clients are able to make these decisions.
And that's also why this course, it's important for engineers, and in fact, some might already know some parts. It's just always good to get a refresher. But it's also important for the professionals that work with engineers, just to get an understanding of what are the types of things you can be asking, right? Seeing the different types of projects, seeing the low carbon technologies that exist, looking at different heat pumps, different strategies for electrification. All of a sudden now you can go, oh, these are the things that I should be asking about. I can be asking for low carbon buildings. I can be asking for that high efficiency. It's not something that's crazy. Like you were saying, we have the technologies to be able to deliver these high performance buildings now. We don't need to develop anything else. We just need to be asking for higher standards and rising to the challenges that come with that. Because it is always easier not to do something. It's 100% easier not to do something than to do it. But we have this global challenge in front of us, and I feel confident that engineers want to rise to that challenge.
And I think a big part of the role of engineers, like I said, is to not just so there's the questions that we need the developers to be asking, and there's the questions that we want the tradesmen and the architects to be asking. But there are also things that engineers need to be proactive in helping to put forward. You know what I mean? Like that these are your options. And that's what I think this course helps to do too. So, what a big part of why the CEGBC and the government decided to fund this is because they were talking about the just transition. And, the just transition, when you think about it right now, is, we know, for instance, that significantly more jobs are going to be created as we're transitioning to this quote unquote green jobs than will be lost as we move away from fossil fuels. So we know this. In the long term, there's going to be significantly more jobs. And right now, as we're transitioning those folks who have, incredible skill sets that are working within fossil fuels and transitioning them, that's this whole just transition piece. Right? So we're transitioning them into this green economy because they have transferable skills. Right now, that group is still predominantly white male. And so when we're thinking about just transition, and what I like about this course too, is not only is it helping existing engineers, which, when we're thinking about, just to give context, for instance, for engineering, right now in engineering, we're currently sitting at 15% of the profession are women. Women make up 51% of the population, but they make up 15% of engineering. And when you start looking at other marginalized groups like Indigenous, when you start looking at racialized majorities, look at even less so, right? So when we're thinking about just transition within this context, within engineering, we do have a bit of a hill to climb. And so, and we have to climb it because because for me, when we look at this net zero buildings and we look at this course, it's not all in the course, but we've tried to incorporate so that way the course is helping us move this way. But when we think about the just transition, if we aren't meaningfully engaging marginalized groups, then what we're going to do is we're going to transition to a decarbonized economy that's still inequitable. But the net zero economy, because we have all these jobs that we know that we're going to be creating, there's a huge gap that, that the current population can't fill. We need to bring in new engineers. There's an opportunity here for us to ensure that those new engineers are coming with these diverse lived experiences, that they're from these marginalized groups. And if we're able to do that, and this course is an example of how we're starting to do that by, intentionally working with marginalized groups in the development of the content, intentionally targeting and supporting these groups to be able to access the course, to be able to upskill so that way they can meaningfully participate in this transitioning economy. Then we have an opportunity through net zero buildings and through our transition to this decarbonized economy to literally redress some of the historical inequities that exist in today's economy. And so for me, when I look at net zero buildings, for me, it's this North Star, it's this opportunity where we have a chance to, when it comes to marginalized groups, where we have a chance to meaningfully engage and get them involved in ensuring that they have the skill sets to be able to lead this change. Because we know that they're disproportionately impacted. We know that right now, they're, the whole definition of marginalized groups is that they, the power dynamics aren't there. They aren't being able to fully engage in engineering, and by that, not able to fully engage in all the opportunities that net zero buildings and this transition is going to encounter. So part of what is exciting about where we're going with things is this opportunity to be able to meaningfully bring them in. Because if we can do that, then not only are we now starting to address these big global issues in relation to the climate crisis, but we're also starting to deal with a couple of other big global issues when it comes to gender inequity, when it comes to the different power dynamics that exist all over the world right now. So that's one of the things that kind of excites me too, because this is an opportunity.
See, I 100%, and I can tell you, like, I'm in the field. We are building buildings right now. Somebody listening to this might say, that sounds like tokenism. It is not tokenism. There is so much work from the design, from the construction, from the operation. There is so much work to do. We need so much more workforce. We're having trouble filling trades right now or things like that. So at the end of the day, the way that I look at this is if there is anybody who is interested in picking up a hammer to go and do a high performance building, or who is willing to pick up a pen to go and do 200 hood fan balancings in order to have a high performance building, we need those people to see themselves in that profession in order to bring them in. So no, it's not like tokenism. It's if they don't see themselves in those roles, if they can't see a path to being part of that process, we are missing out on a huge wealth of knowledge and on a huge portion of that workforce. And the problem is, in terms of, new buildings is one thing. Retrofitting existing buildings is an absolutely monumental task. And the way that I look at it is I want absolutely everybody with maybe an education that comes from somewhere else that we're not familiar with, or anybody who's willing to do some calculations, that they see a path to get involved in low carbon buildings.
Mm-hmm. I guess for the engineering piece, when we, what I sort of just described is clearly a little bit more of a long-term piece, right? Like meaningfully engaging with marginalized group. You don't become an engineer overnight. There's, you have to go to school, then you have to have X amount of, work experience, and so that's definitely something that Engineers Canada has made a commitment to, and that you're going to see us continue to drive forward. And net zero buildings is just one area where we know that there's this huge potential. There's also work that we need to do in the short term, and I think that we modeled that on how we created this course. So what I mean by that is, like, in the short term, like I said, we're not gonna have 50% of the engineering profession that are working in this be women by tomorrow. It's not going to happen. But what we can do is we can ensure, like what you were saying, like as we're starting to design these buildings, because buildings are where we live and where we work, where we play, we can make sure that we are meaningfully engaging them up front in the design of those buildings. So for instance, one of the things that we recently created, we created a guideline on Indigenous consultation and engagement. And so it goes through and starts to outline and guide engineers and support engineers, and how do you meaningfully engage with those communities to ensure that when you're starting to build things for those communities, that's being taken in consideration. Like how do you work with them in a meaningful way? How do you meaningfully engage them, make sure that they're being heard, making sure that the thing you're designing meets their social and physical needs and spiritual needs, right? And so there's that kind of work that we could be doing up front. And then that we have to, like, when we're thinking about the process, that's one of the things we need to do. And I remember because, about 5 years ago, I worked a little bit in the green building space, and one of the things that was interesting is that the design process and how you have to have these design charrettes, right? And the whole
integrated design process.
Integrated design process, and the whole intent of that is that the only way you can really get to net zero, because it's complicated and you have to take in all these different considerations, that you had to, right from the very beginning, have all these interest holders at the table to have those conversations. And so there's this opportunity now. And I think initially when we used to think about that 10 years ago, the interest holders were like, we'll have the architect there and we'll have the engineer there and we'll have, you know, the head of the trade person there or whatever. But now we're saying you also need to have some key representatives of that community who could speak to and ensure that you're meeting those local needs there. And they need to have an equal place at that table to be able to, you know what I mean, to ensure that what you're designing and building is meeting those needs. And it's easier said than done. For sure. But that's part of what we're talking about now is like, what can we do in the short term? It's about as you're putting together these design charrettes, as you're trying to create these net zero buildings and you're building for these different communities, how are you meaningfully engaging and consulting with and listening to these communities to make sure that they're meeting the needs today and over the next decade? And then long term, how are we ensuring that we're providing access to these groups so that way they're at the table as the engineer and as the architect and as, you know, or as the developer, helping to carve out those decisions.
There's an opportunity right now. Like the other thing we have to realize, the reason we need those voices at the table is because we can't mess this up. We like in Canada, we need to add hundreds of thousands of homes to the overall portfolio. And there's a group, the Task Force for Climate and Housing, that's just trying to make that case of we kind of get one shot at this. Let's get everybody at the table and make sure that we hit these high performance targets in one shot. And we understand that that building might transition through different life cycles, right? So making sure that that type of consultation gives that building an actual shot at that full life cycle. You need those voices at the table because we only get one shot. We've got to have very high performing, low carbon buildings being produced today, because coming back and retrofitting these would be a monumental mistake and a missed opportunity is the sad part.
And so we've covered a whole lot here talking about the code of ethics, engineers' duty to the public, the environment itself, as well as the people that they serve. Do you have any particular thoughts that you want to share with the audience just to wrap things up? Is there anything pressing? Is there any key messaging that you want folks to leave with today?
I mean, in my opinion, this is kind of a call to action, right? This is one way, this course is one of multiple different ways that you can participate in that low carbon transition. We know we need to do something monumental, so find the way that you want to get involved and really get in there as much as possible. There is so much work to do. And maybe the way that I'd also frame it is, this is gonna be hard. We've unfortunately burned up all of our spare time. We could have been doing a nice slow transition if we'd, maybe gotten our act together 20 years ago. But we've had the same target of that net zero goal, but we've basically shortened our fuse. So now we've got maybe a more aggressive burn that needs to take place. So I would challenge all the engineering professionals, all of the building professionals, in all honesty, as well as the clients, the developers, the owners. Let's challenge ourselves to producing those high performance buildings. Come up with those creative solutions, because what we've been doing in the past, that business as usual status quo, it is not cutting it, and it is just killing us. So we really need to step up our game, and no better crew, in my opinion, to do that than engineers. They tend to love a challenge.
I mean, I just echo what Dan's saying. I think it's actually an exciting time to be an engineer, especially if you're currently in high school or you're currently in your first or second year of engineering. This might be an area that you didn't realize is it's going to open up so many doors for you. So, or if you're an existing engineer, like you said, it's what did you call it? It's crunch time. It's crunch time.
You've only got 20 years left.
We've got 20 years left.
And if we don't start now, we're going to burn past our limits, right? So
I think now is a fantastic opportunity for people who are interested in this to start to learn more about how they can get directly engaged in it, because there's not going to be any shortage of work. Engineers are currently and will continue to be expected to lead the way in how we get there.
Exciting times. You've heard it from our speakers today. This is a call to action. Engineers, builders, architects, as well as other practitioners in this field, you do have a responsibility to the public. You do have that duty to ensure that the environment is safe, and you also need to keep in mind those who you're actually serving. So different populations, equity deserving groups, people from marginalized groups who need access to different resources to really improve their quality of life, and doing this in a way that ensures that everyone is accounted for and that everyone is at the table. I would like to thank the Government of Canada. I would like to thank the Canada Green Building Council for funding this project, as well as Climate Risk Institute, Polytechnique Montreal, and of course Engineers Canada for all of their work towards putting this course together and ensuring that it reaches the different populations that we're serving. And with that, we will now turn it over for live questions. We are sure that you'll have questions about the course itself, as well as your role as engineers and other practitioners in creating positive change in our society and tackling climate change, which is a very pressing issue today. And so with that, we want to say thank you so much for joining, and we will be engaging in our live Q&A shortly.
Hi, folks. We hope that you thoroughly enjoyed that discussion and found it significantly insightful. As we said, now we'll be taking any questions that you may have. And I see that folks have started to put questions using the Q&A functionality, which is excellent. And then if any questions come up as we go, feel free to keep putting them in there. And if there's any specific speaker that you would like to touch on the question that you're asking, feel free to indicate that as well. So we'll be addressing questions over the next 20 to 25 minutes. And I will start to take questions from the chat. So there's one here from Catherine. Catherine is asking, how does retrofitting for climate change effects get factored in? And they've provided sea level rise as an example. They say, I hear a lot about low carbon, but very little about the changes in weather patterns and flood risk. Also, are there funding resources available to assist nonprofits providing housing to vulnerable populations to help adapt to these environmental challenges? Catherine is working with a housing development nonprofit that comes alongside nonprofits from feasibility and concept through to construction. And in their searching, it seems that there's more money where the mouth is in terms of carbon emissions and energy efficiency than other requisite adaptations for housing stock. So it sounds like this question might be better suited for Dan, given his expertise. And so I'll turn it over to Dan to provide a response to that.
Yeah, how about it, Catherine? Excellent question. Kind of like two different, so we, in terms of resource, in terms of, hey, we need to be planning for that flood risk, that different, the different heat or cooling loads. We need to be planning for different levels of humidity, all that. We do touch on that a little bit in the course in terms of looking at what are called like future climate atlases, looking at different varying precipitation that we might see in the future, varying snow loads or things like that. So we touch on that in the course, and you're absolutely right. That needs to be part of the conversation. We can be looking at today or historical weather data in terms of projecting what our buildings are going to need 50 years from now. So that's very important. But to your question in terms of, you're correct that I have also seen most of the funding right now is in a mitigation strategy, if you will. Let us decarbonize the buildings that exist. Let's make sure that new buildings aren't emitting as much carbon. The adaptation side that you were describing in terms of, hey, my building is now in a floodplain when it was in a 100-year floodplain, and now we're getting floods every 10 years rather than every 100 years. I can imagine various different ways that the weather is impacting. You are correct that there isn't as much money on that side. Adaptation is part, like mitigation and adaptation. We're unfortunately getting to that point where now adaptation needs to be part of the strategy because we've burned up some of our opportunity for mitigation. So I would anticipate, and I do hope that we will see some of that in the future, but exactly what it will look like, that is an extremely good challenge. Because, for example, permafrost melting up in the northern Canada, how do you move that building? How do you reshore or give footings to that building? Those are the types of programs or the types of planning and funding that we're going to need to start thinking about as we have burned up our mitigation time, and now we need to start adapting our buildings. Yes.
Thanks, Dan. I see that Jeanette has her hand up, so I'll pass it over to Jeanette, and I think Sam might have something to add to this conversation as well. So over to you, Jeanette.
Great. Thanks very much, Eileen. I wanted to share that one of the tools that Engineers Canada developed with the support of Natural Resources Canada and also other organizations over the years is a tool called, and it's a long name and it's a long acronym, the Public Infrastructure Engineering Vulnerability Committee Protocol, or the PIVC protocol. It is a protocol that was designed to be able to understand and to assist in mitigating the challenges to infrastructure that are posed by changing climate. And Dan spoke about how we need to be able to look at what the data is. We need to be able to look at the predictions of what the conditions are going to be in the future to be able to understand the vulnerabilities. One of the great things about PIVC is that it is now a piece of work that is jointly owned by the Climate Risk Institute, by the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, and by the German International Development Agency. So Engineers Canada transferred ownership, and over the years, it's been applied globally. So there's a great bank of data, but there's also a wonderful process there that can be applied to many different types of infrastructure and many different types of built environments. And not only existing environments, but looking at how will things be built and how do things need to be maintained to be able to continue to maintain that resilience. So I'll stop there, except to say that I believe that some of the other courses that the Climate Risk Institute offers also touch on these areas. And those courses as a group lead towards the infrastructure resilience professional designation that Sam was speaking about earlier. Thanks so much. Back to you, Eileen.
Thanks, Jeanette. I'll pass it over to Sam to add to that as well.
Jeanette, you perfectly teed me up for what I was going to say, so thank you for that. Just to add on to what Jeanette was talking about, so with the Climate Risk Institute, we do have a lot of courses specifically on adaptation. I did post a link in the chat if you're interested in looking at those, but the Infrastructure Resilience Professional credential includes a PIVC kind of risk and vulnerability assessment course. Also, management of climate risk for infrastructure professionals, applied climate science, climate law, climate smart policy and procurement, as well as we also have a planning course as well for any planners. I know not the professionals necessarily on the call today, but we do have a planners course as well. So lots of training available for that more adaptation, resiliency piece. And then this is kind of the low carbon piece, but recognizing, as Dan said, they are not separate conversations. They are one and the same, and everything, both sides need to be kind of considered when we're planning for a resilient future.
Thank you for your contribution, Sam. And then the next question here is from Sharia. Sharia is asking, compared to retrofitting a 1950s townhouse block, what kind of challenges or benefits do you anticipate when it comes to retrofitting larger 50-plus-year-old apartment style high-rise buildings? Maybe I'll leave this one open and then folks can sort of add in as we go on.
I can maybe start because excellent question. And we did the townhome first because it was easier, it was smaller. But we are literally trying to apply the lessons learned from the Pressland project to a high-rise building context. So once again, trying to target a 60% energy reduction, as well as a full GHG reduction. So the first challenge, in all honesty, when you're dealing with a high rise, you've got the same footprint, but you've got a lot more energy density. So you are not going to reach a net zero building in a high rise context. That is a big challenge, and you're just going to end up, if that's what you need to do, you're going to end up with renewable energy credits somewhere, purchasing power somewhere else, just because you don't have the resource that is falling on that same footprint has 10 more stories underneath. The second one is trying to then recladding or doing any sort of envelope retrofit on a 15-story high-rise, for example. Much more challenging than on a 2-story townhome. So that's the first one we're trying to figure out, is how do you revive that building envelope that we know that as they are coming to their life cycle tipping point where there needs to be something done. Our windows need to be done. There's some repointing or some cladding issues that need to be tackled. So we're figuring out how to do that, potentially maybe incorporating some photovoltaics into that building envelope, maybe some renewables there. And then you tackle the mechanical system, trying to, how do you remove the natural gas being consumed within the ventilation system, for example, for the air makeups, or maybe the different heating systems for boilers for heating and or domestic hot water, basically trying to electrify those. And it's not, electrifying them is not necessarily the problem, but that building is definitely not designed for that kind of a load. So hopefully you've got room within your existing electrical vault, but maybe you don't, and therefore you need a broader electrical retrofit in order to even be able to electrify that equipment. Then the question is, well, your building is within, you know, an electricity grid. So can your local grid actually take that additional load? And that's when it becomes really important to have that really good building envelope, because just switching over, fuel switching from a natural gas to just electrification would put huge strain on that existing grid, just because you're turning a switch and you're trying to now get as much electricity as was coming in through the natural gas. So you really need to reduce the energy consumption for that building in order for you to not impact that grid when you do the electrification.
Thank you, Dan. Does anyone else want to add to that at all? All right, looks like we're set to go to the next question here. And this one seems to be particularly around equity, diversity, and inclusion. So Janessa is asking, if we are creating buildings today that are meant to serve future generations, yet we do not have adequate representation of marginalized communities on today's low carbon teams, how can we ensure the buildings that we are creating today are going to effectively consider and be equitable for these communities, especially considering few women are in the construction or engineering workforce? And I will pass this one to Kim, and of course, other folks can add on as well.
Great, thanks, Eileen. And yeah, great question by Janessa. Sustainable building design is not only about minimizing the environment, the environmental impact of construction operations. It's also about ensuring that future generations, as you're alluding to, can enjoy the same or better quality of life as the present one. So this is sort of like the principle of intergenerational equity, essentially, which means that we should not compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs by overusing or degrading natural resources, creating additional social inequities, or generating excessive waste. And so the way that we've started to talk about this right now, and I know that Dan alluded to this earlier when he was talking about how important energy efficiency is. So not only do we know that the vast majority of greenhouse gases are because of how we're using fossil fuels to produce energy, but that also has impacts, as we know that the cost of those things are going to increase. And so you start to have, like what he was referring to as like energy poverty, water conservation, material selection. All these things that we're talking about is talking about ensuring that future generations, that we have intergenerational equity. So when we're talking about material selection, for instance, we're talking about selecting materials that have low environmental and social impacts throughout their life cycle. But a big part of what I was sort of alluding to, and why we decided to support this course, and why we had folks look at through an EDI lens, is that a fourth way to sort of achieve intergenerational equity in sustainable building design is to promote social justice, which means that everyone should have equal access to the benefits and opportunities of the development, regardless of their gender, race, class, or ability. So by designing your buildings to be inclusive, accessible, affordable, and culturally appropriate, you can ensure that it meets the diverse needs and preferences of its current and ideally future occupants and users. You can also engage, and this is sort of what we're talking about by the integrated design process, and why it's important is that you have to engage with the local community and interest holders, such as the residents, the workers, customers, to understand their values, concerns, and expectations, and incorporate their feedback and participation into building design process. This is what I was alluding to about like how we're putting more on engineers than we were before. It's not enough for you to have that technical expertise to understand how to put together these low carbon, super efficient buildings that are also ideally designed in a way that's helping to adapt to our changing climate. But now there's an expectation that you need to have a better understanding of the needs of your clients and the communities that you're serving. That's a whole other skill set and knowledge that we're putting on engineers. And it's becoming increasingly important because it's good design. Like if you're not designing for the communities that you're serving, if you aren't able to incorporate those concerns into your design, then it's poor design. And so if you don't have those people on your team today, then you need to incorporate it and integrate it into your process to ensure that you're getting that information, that you're meaningfully engaging with them. Otherwise, you're going to design something that isn't going to be good for future generations. And it's not going to meet all the needs of that community. And that's what's unique about buildings, because, as you know, we spend like 90% of our time in a building. And so this becomes particularly relevant and important.
Thank you, Kim, for that. Dan, Jeanette, or Sam, is there anything you would like to add on to that in terms of weaving in equity, diversity, and inclusion in relation to sustainability? Jeanette, go ahead. Oh, you're just muted. There we go.
Thanks, Eileen. So one of the thoughts that I had is that creating buildings, creating spaces are very complex projects, and they involve engineers, but they also involve, and Sam mentioned this also, many other professions and many other parts of our communities, our planners, our landscape architects, the community representatives themselves. And knowing that, as Janessa mentioned in her question, that there are very few women in the construction engineering workforce, although advances are being made and the numbers continue to increase, which is really wonderful to see. Looking at the overall composition of the teams that are working on the projects, not only the engineers, but the other professionals, the members of the community, those who are working on the project, and ensuring that there is a diverse, equitable, and inclusive team overall can be a bridge to the future. And what we envision in the future is having more diversity, equity, and inclusion in the engineering profession, but of course in all professions and in the community too. Thank you. And I see a note that says that Sam would like to answer this question live. So over to Sam.
Oh, I don't have anything to add. I'm not sure why it says that on the thing. Sorry, Jeanette.
Alrighty then. So it looks like the other questions that we have are particularly around accessing the course itself. So questions around if it's free, what the cost is, as well as if there will be any opportunities for follow-up questions via email. So if you have any further questions, you can reach out to Climate Risk Institute or Engineers Canada. We can put our emails in the chat there so that you have that accessible. And also know that this particular session is going to be on YouTube later on. So if there's any chance that you want to rewatch this or share with other folks, you're welcome to do that as well. And then speaking to the to access for the course itself, we actually have a link in the chat right now, which specifies the different opportunities for the in-person courses that are available and free of charge. So those are coming up in Ottawa and Toronto. Toronto spots are filled at the moment, but we still have several spots for Ottawa. So if you are in the city and you're interested in taking advantage of this excellent opportunity, we highly encourage you to do so. Sam, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, I do on this one. And just to follow up that, we are able to offer this course right now completely free of charge because of the funding from the federal government through CAGBC. But post March 31st, the funding is gone. And so I know CRI is interested in continuing to offer this course similar to our other courses, resilient professional courses. But there will be a cost. So we highly recommend that if you are in the Ottawa area, unfortunately, Toronto is sold out, but if you are in the Ottawa area, join us now while the course is free for our in-person session. But there is a wait list, a link for if you're interested in hearing about future opportunities. Please put your name on the wait list. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sam. I will just be putting our email in the chat so you can contact the Belonging and Engagement team if you have questions. That's from Engineers Canada's side. And if folks from the Climate Risk Institute want to do that as well, that would be fantastic. So I'm going to put it in there now. All right, there we go. And yeah, with that, this brings us to the end of today's session. As Sam has mentioned, there's opportunity to take advantage of these courses in person for free. So we highly encourage you folks to take advantage of that. We thank you so much for engaging in this conversation today. We hope that it was significantly insightful and that you found it very, very valuable as engineers and professionals in this space. And, thinking about ways that we can really start to continue to make that positive impact in society by ensuring that we're weaving in equity, diversity, and inclusion with sustainability, because they definitely do go in tandem. So thank you so much, everyone. I will give us back 8 minutes of our day, and I hope that you have an excellent rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Everyone.